You don't know how good you've got it. Welcome to the depths. Hello, welcome to Reading from the Depths. My name is Lecton. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today is the next installment of my series, The Buddhist Path in Fiction, Stephen King edition. And this is technically the second episode, I suppose, in the series. Last month there was an introduction. This is the first episode where we're actually going to talk about a book together, and today that is going to be The Long Walk. So what I want to start by saying, and I'm probably going to say this at the beginning of every video because people may not watch all these videos in order, and it's kind of important to say, is that I am not making any claims that the author believes any of these things. I am going to be looking for different Buddhist philosophical or soteriological ideas in the text, but I don't think these are the beliefs of the author. In fact, the author will have themes that they want to explore, and they may overlap or coincide or be concordant with these ideas, but what I'm trying to do is not find out the specific meaning that the author was putting into this text, but instead I'm trying to model an example of what I like to call intimate reading, where I bring my full self to the text. In my case, that means over 2 decades worth of Buddhist contemplation and study and meditation. And by bringing my full self to the text, what I am hopefully doing is finding something in the text that gives me an opportunity to learn something new about myself and about the world around me. So these are different ideas that emerge for me as I read the text. And it may be a similar idea to a theme or a concept that the author is playing with, or it might be something as simple as I read a certain line of dialogue or a certain line of narration, and that sparks a separate thought or a jumping off point for me, that it makes me think of something. Or at the very least, even if I don't find anything in the text, I always have how I experience the text, which is to say that I can look at if there's a character or an action that causes me to be frustrated or causes me joy, or if I have any sort of emotional reaction to the text, that's an opportunity to examine where did that emotion come from? What was it about this character's statement or this action or this bit of narration that caused me to feel a certain way? And so there's always an opportunity for me to explore myself within the text. So I'm not making any claims about what the author means in the text. I don't think that the author is putting any of these Buddhist ideas in the text intentionally. That is not my claim. But this is me bringing my full self to the text as a way of modeling intimate reading. With that said, up front, the video will have kind of 3 parts. The first part is going to be a summary or a brief discussion of the specific Buddhist idea that I wanted to highlight with this book. The second part will be a quick summary of the book, and there will be spoilers. I won't give any unnecessary spoilers. So things that don't need to be spoiled, I won't spoil. But you can expect the ending of the book at least to be spoiled. And then lastly, the kind of most important part of the video is the analysis. So once I have laid out some different Buddhist ideas that I want to think about, and I've given you a summary of the book, then I'll actually go into the book. Maybe I'll pull out some quotes or just some different passages and look at how that relates to these different Buddhist ideas and what came up for me as I was reading the book. As always, there are timestamps down in the description, so feel free to jump ahead to whatever section you want to jump to. As I mentioned in my introduction video, I wanted to structure these videos and these discussions around a series of Buddhist philosophical ideas or topics for meditation that are constructed in a specific sequence that we're taught as a way to encourage our deeper understanding and our meditation practice. And so I chose a book that hopefully has something to say about the specific topic that I brought up. Sometimes it's a stretch, sometimes it's going to fit perfectly. We're going to see how it goes. Today, I want to talk about the topic of perfect human rebirth. So, perfect human rebirth is one of the very first topics we meditate on. And the reason we meditate on a perfect human rebirth is because it is an opportunity for us to recognize our privileges and how incredibly rare and lucky it is to have everything we have, the opportunities that we have. And by meditating on that and becoming convinced of how fortunate we are, that encourages us to use our life in a meaningful way. So when we talk about a perfect human rebirth, we don't simply mean being born human. It's often qualified by having a birth that has 8 freedoms and 10 richnesses or 10 endowments. And I'm not going to go through all 18 of those, especially because there is some overlap. But the point of them is that not only are we born human, but we're born in a space and a time where we have good mental and physical capacity to engage in a spiritual practice. We're born in a place where there are spiritual teachings available, and there are students and teachers who follow those teachings that make them available to us. And we are born in a place where we have the religious freedom to engage in that spiritual practice. So it isn't just about our body, it's about our body, our mind, and our circumstances all working together to make it possible for us to engage in deep introspection and in spiritual practice. So, as it's taught, it's specifically talking about Buddhist practice, but I think it's applicable to all of us that we have freedoms that even in this world we see others don't have. And so, to have a perfect human rebirth means not only to have a body that is mentally and physically capable of engaging in this kind of practice, but also being in a time and a place where the spiritual teachings are available and you can practice them. It's easy to say that and not have it given any strong impact. So there are a number of ways we talk about it to emphasize how incredibly rare and fortunate it is to be born the way we are and the time and the place we are. The the first way we talk about it is we express how rare it is by means of an example. And the example they give is really beautiful. The example is if you were to imagine the whole earth is made of nothing but ocean. There's no land. There's only ocean, and that ocean is has constant waves crashing against themselves the whole time. And on that ocean, on that whole earth-sized ocean, there is an oxen's yoke. So the yoke is the part of the harness that fits around an oxen's neck when it is linked up to a cart, right? Or a plow of some sort. So that yoke is floating on the ocean surface, being tossed around by the waves. And now in that ocean, there lives a blind sea turtle who only comes up for air once every 100 years. The likelihood that that sea turtle will surface and will surface right in the center of that ox's yoke is more likely than you being reborn as a human with a perfect human rebirth. Now, I know that's a fantastical story, right? But the point of it is to develop a sense of awe, a sense of admiration of the majesty of being born with the privileges that we have. We have so many things available to us, and to not use them is criminal, essentially. And so that metaphor is used to express the awe, the unbelievability of being reborn as a human. And so another way that the rareness is expressed is we just think of it in a numerical sense. So as Buddhists, we believe there are different types of rebirth. There are upper rebirths, which is to be reborn as a human or a demigod or a god, and there's lower rebirths where you can be reborn as an animal or a hungry ghost or a hell being. But even if we think of only the rebirths that we have the capacity to see in our lives, so humans and animals, if we don't worry about the other ones because we don't have the kind of meditative capacity or the correct karmic imprints to observe those other types of beings, we can observe humans and we can observe animal beings. Look at all the animals in the world. Just look at the insects that live in your neighborhood. And the number of insects in your neighborhood far outnumber rather, the number of humans in the whole world, right? But still, we are born a human. So numerically, between animals and humans, there are far more animals. You're far more likely to be reborn as an animal, just based on numbers alone. And yet, we have this human body. We have this human intellect. We have these privileges, these opportunities available to us that none of those animals have. So numerically, it is incredibly rare to be reborn as a human, and especially as a human that has the 8 freedoms and the 10 richnesses, that has all of the opportunities that we have. So not only do we teach that it's rare by using the metaphor, we teach it's rare by understanding numerically how incredibly rare it is. And then the last way we often talk about how rare this perfect human rebirth is we think about what are the causes that bring about a perfect human rebirth. So we say in the primary causes of being reborn as a human that is endowed with the 8 freedoms and the 10 richnesses is stainless prayers, but more importantly, having perfect morality. And we can look at our own lives. I can look at my life and see what my practice of morality is. And I know that as much effort as I exert in it, it isn't perfect, right? But in order to have a perfect human rebirth, we have to have practiced perfect morality. So in the past, in our past lives, we practiced perfect morality, a type of practice that we probably aren't capable of in this life, or at least is very difficult, for someone like me to practice. And yet we did that in the past. And we combined that with stainless prayers and with other practices to create the causes and conditions that would allow us to be reborn as human in this life. And so those causes are very, very difficult to collect. Okay? Very hard to have perfect morality and to have perfect stainless prayers. And yet we did that. And now we're reaping the benefits of that hard work. right? The results of that hard work is this life right here. All the opportunities we have right now are the results of all that work in the past. And so if we think about that, it also encourages us that we've done all the work to get here. Why would we stop now? Why would we give all this up? Why would we give it away? Why would we waste this opportunity? They often say that having a perfect human rebirth and then not using it to engage in spiritual practice is like traveling the ocean to this long lost island made of jewels and then returning empty handed. Going through facing sea monsters and tidal waves and all the things you could face in an unruly ocean, making it to this fabled island full of jewels and then leaving and taking nothing with you. You know, you've found the best treasure that is ever possible and then you've given it up. The other way they actually talk about it is they say it's even worse than that. It's worse than having a jewel and giving it up. It's like taking a precious diamond in your hand and exchanging it for rotten meat. It's taking something valuable and instead replacing it with something that is going to cause you harm, is going to cause sickness. By taking this life and wasting it, by not using it in a meaningful way, then not only are we squandering an opportunity, but we're creating negative imprints. We're taking this incredible opportunity and doing the opposite, right? We're going in the wrong direction with it. If we're encouraging our own greed, our own ego, our own anger in any way, anything that encourages our self-grasping, right? Anything that encourages our self-cherishing mind, anything that isn't working for the benefit of others, this is, to some extent, wasting this incredible opportunity we have. So when we think of a perfect human rebirth, we talk about it and we meditate on it as a way to encourage us to engage in spiritual practice by recognizing the incredible opportunities we have, how rare it is, and how fortunate and blessed we are to have not only this body, not only this mind, but to be in these circumstances with the people and animals and everything we have around us. To be in this environment at this time in this place is incredibly rare. It's an opportunity we all have. Anyone watching this video has an incredible opportunity, has a gift that the vast majority of sentient beings does not have. And so to not use this life to the best of our ability to make your life meaningful, then it is a waste. You're taking all of this privilege you have, all the hard work you did to be reborn with these opportunities, and you're throwing it into the toilet. You're wasting it. So that is why we meditate on a perfect human rebirth. That meditation, becoming familiar with that concept, encourages our practice. It makes it so that we want to practice all the time. That's part of the reason when I engage in things like reading, when I create relationships with art, I do it in such a way that I try to make meaning out of it because I don't want to waste this opportunity I have, this rare opportunity of being reborn with this body and this mind. So that is perfect human rebirth in a nutshell. Let's talk about the book. This book, The Long Walk, was published in 1979, but famously, as King mentions in the introduction to the Bachman Books edition, before he wrote Carrie, which was his first published novel, he had written 5 novels. And he said of those 5 novels, 2 of them were good. One was Rage, and one was The Long Walk. Now, Rage, he started writing when he was in high school. He wrote about half of it, he says, and then he stopped. And then he got to college, and as a freshman in college, he wrote The Long Walk. So it was the first novel he completed. And then he finished writing Rage after he finished The Long Walk. And then it wasn't published, like I said, until 1979 after Carrie was published, which was in 1974. And so who knows what editing happened between the original version and the version that was eventually published, you know? But still, he was essentially 18 years old when he wrote this. And in large part, it is a response to the Vietnam War and the way the American military complex just throws away human life, and the way young men were sent into this death machine for nothing, for no real benefit, no help for anyone. And so it's his response to that. It's worth noting that in the year 2000, the American Library Association listed this book as one of the top 100 books that all teenagers need to read. That was written in the last half of the 20th century. So from 1966 to 2000, they pulled out 100 books that they said all teenagers need to read, or 100 fiction books, and I think also 100 nonfiction. But this is one of those top 100 fiction books that the American Library Association said was written between 1966 and 2000, and all teenagers need to read. In 2023, this book was banned in a school district in Florida. So that's the kind of time we live in, folks. One group celebrates this as being an incredible piece of literature that all teenagers need to read, and another group says, nope, this is dangerous. So it can't be read by anyone, or it shouldn't be allowed in schools. That's where we're at. Now, a very brief summary. The story takes place in a dystopian alternate version of the US. We know it's a little bit alternate version because there are 51 states mentioned at one point and a few other things that are just a little bit tweaked. And it seems to be some sort of authoritarian regime, possibly a military dictatorship. It's not 100% clear. But you do know that you can very simply be squatted. There are squads of people that just disappear, people that speak out. Even, our main character, his father was squatted. His father was a truck driver, and he spoke out against the walk, this competition, this annual competition. And a squad came to his house one night and took him away, and he's never seen again. And they don't know what happens when you're squatted. They assume they're executed, but no one knows. They're just never seen again. There's no prison, there's no trial, there's nothing. Once the squad comes for you, you're done for. We also have this impression that it is a military dictatorship of some sort because the main figure who oversees the walk is someone called the major. And the major, everyone has this kind of sycophantic awe of him. He's like a rock star, and he has such like a control over the people that even the boys who are walking, they at some point once they start walking, talk about how much they hate him and they want to spit on him and they want to yell in his face. But then when they see him, they're all praise because they can't control it. They have this kind of fervor around him. So it takes place in a somewhat alternate US, that's dystopian future, authoritarian government, possibly military dictatorship. And the very simple premise is that every year on May 1st, 100 boys from the ages, I think, of 14 to 18 start walking. And they start up in Maine near the Canadian border, and they walk until only one is left. If you slow down below 4 miles an hour for more than 30 seconds, you get a warning. And after 3 warnings, you get a ticket. And that ticket is a gunshot to the head. If you're lucky, there's at least one boy who gets gut shot repeatedly because he needs to be made an example because he acted out of line. Now, if you walk for an hour without any warnings, then one of your warnings will be erased. And so this is something that happens over and over again, that our main character gets to having 3 warnings. So there's a lot of pressure, but then they disappear. And that allows there to be this rise and fall in the plot's momentum. So that's the whole plot. It's a very simple plot. Now, we start the morning of the walk. We meet our main character. And the world building, this discussion of the dystopian world and so forth, is done in very small bits and pieces. Like the purpose of the walk, the prize you get by winning this walk, is never even 100% clearly mentioned. And when it is mentioned, it isn't mentioned for, maybe 20 or 30 pages into the book. The prize seems to be whatever you want for the rest of your life. Like it's very vague. It's very open-ended. And then you learn more details about the walk, the way you have to go to basically a recruitment center, you have to pass a physical and mental exam to be considered, and then once all your names are considered, there is a live raffle where 200 names are pulled out, and of those 200, 100 of them are called prime walkers, and those are the ones that are supposed to walk that year. The other 100 are replacements or backups, but you don't know which one you are, and there are a couple deadlines where you can back out, but at some point you find out if you're a prime walker or a backup walker. And then at some point, you no longer have the luxury of backing out. You're stuck into it. So you learn that slowly throughout the story, right? The way he builds the world is really, really meticulous because he's focused on these boys, on these characters. Now, our main character is a 16-year-old named Ray Garrity, and there are a number of other characters. At one point, someone jokes it's the 8 Musketeers. So there's a number of boys you kind of follow that he falls into a group with. His best friend on the walk ends up being, or the person he ends up being closest to, is another young man named Peter McGrees. You have an antagonist. You have this one character who is very hateful and spiteful and says all these mean things. And so he kind of serves as a low-level antagonist in the story. You have one character who is kind of silent, and he's at one point referenced as the skinny Buddha who just stays in the back of the queue. You have another character who he's like the odds-on favorite to win, and you find out more about him as you go along. So there's a half dozen or so boys who stay in a cluster around our main character, and we follow what happens to them. So as I mentioned, the plot is very simple in that way. There are a few more details about the walk. As you go, you learn that there are always soldiers that are flanking them, keeping track of their time with all the sophisticated gadgets that are on the trucks that they are, the convoys that the soldiers are on. And there are crowds lining the streets, depending on where they are. In the big cities, there are crowds, and some of the country roads, there aren't as big crowds. And at nighttime, there aren't as big crowds because you can't stop walking. You start at 9 in the morning, and you go until there's only one walker left. And in our case, it is into the fifth day. They walk into the fifth day. And our main character is the winner at the end. And you can kind of guess that. He's either going to be the winner or he's going to, die and the book will be over. But him winning isn't cut and dry. It isn't simple. Actually, this is one of King's most brilliant endings, which is to say something, because King isn't known for always having great endings. And this, the first novel he wrote, has a spectacular ending. I think that's really all I need to give you for plot of the story. That's the whole thing. There are more little details that I might bring up as I go through the points that I want to mention. So now the heart of this, book club, the heart of this practice is the analysis, right? And this is also going to be broken into two parts. As I mentioned, I want to try to talk about a perfect human rebirth as it relates to this. And there are some more general ways that it relates. So I'm going to start with that. And then once I get through that, I want to talk about just general Buddhist philosophical ideas or soteriological points that came up for me, moments of reflection, moments in the book that caused me to take a step back and gave me something to observe in myself or to think about, whether it would be a tangential thought or something like that. But let's start with this topic that I hoped to explore in this book, Perfect Human Rebirth. Obviously, the whole thing is a giant waste of a human life, right? My teacher, Kabji Lama Zopa Rinpoche, he would often talk about how he's so amazed that people do extreme sports, or he is a Nepali, and so he grew up on the Himalayan mountain range, and the fact that people would willingly go hike up Mount Everest was baffling to him, because he's like, there's no reason to do this. Or that people would do any sort of extreme sport, such as skydiving or car racing or anything that puts you in great physical danger. He's like, it's such a waste. It shows such a misunderstanding of the importance of being alive and of all the opportunities you have. And there's no amount of adrenaline rush that you could get that would be worth the risk of giving up this rare opportunity you have to make your life meaningful, to be of service to others. To give that all up for an adrenaline high is the most foolish thing you could do. So this whole walk is an exercise in wasting this incredible opportunity we have, right? So that is like the meta aspect that made me think of this book especially. But then to add on that, and maybe a little bit tangential, is that you see the characters as they're going through the walk. The only way to get through this process is to dehumanize everyone involved, both themselves as the walkers and the audience who's watching. You have to erase your humanity in order to participate in this kind of emotional or psychic violence, right? And so for me, what really stood out to me as I read this book are the instances where these characters are trying to divorce themselves from their humanity. And when they aren't able to do that, how that makes it more difficult for them. I think this kind of dehumanization starts right at the beginning of the book. We meet our main character, Ray Garrity, and right away, you stop using his first name. He's almost always just called by his last name. And that's true for almost all the characters. They're either called by their last name or by their number. They're assigned a number in alphabetical order from 1 to 100. Garrity is 47. And sometimes you get their first names on occasion, but the overwhelming majority of the time that anyone is referenced, it's by their last name or by their number only, because to have a name makes them human. And so to get rid of that creates another layer of distance between you and the humanity of everyone else involved. Another thing that came up a lot for me, especially as there are some characters at one point starts reciting Hail Marys and praying, the walk, like any type of incarceration, actually gives you the freedom to practice a religious belief, but it strips you of every other freedom in the process. And so for me, that's an interesting thing to think about. When you have this freedom of practice, but everything else is taken away from you, where do you go from there? And what does that do for your inner practice? What it made me think of especially is there's a monk, Pelden Gyatso, who was in prisons, in Chinese prisons for many, many years, and he eventually was released. And he wrote a book called The Fire Under the Snow. I think it was later retranslated as to Autobiography of a Tibetan Monk. And he talks about his experience in prison. And he managed to smuggle out some of the torture instruments that were used on him and on fellow monks. And he did a tour of the US and maybe of Europe too before he passed away, talking about his book and his experiences. And, he talks about times when he was in a cell that was so small, he could just barely prostrate. So Buddhists have a practice of lowering ourselves to the ground to touch 5 points of our body, our knees, our hands, and our forehead to the ground in an act of supplication and prostration before the Buddha and before our teachers. And he said, even though I was in this tiny cell and I had no food and I was being treated horribly, I had enough space in my cell to prostrate. And since I could do that, I was okay. Finding this small amount of freedom in an experience of such great suffering is profound. And I think of all of the privileges I have in my life. And of course, I have difficulties. I have obstacles. I have a lot of things that make my life difficult, right? We all do. But instead of fixating on all the obstacles we have, if we can realize that we have freedom as well, freedoms to engage in spiritual practice, freedoms to be of service to others, freedoms to do meaningful inner work, that is so much more powerful than the obstacles. But if we focus on the obstacles, we'll never make any progress. So as I saw these boys reciting Hail Marys, that's all they had left to them. They had no other freedom. But what kind of freedom is that? To practice a path of meaning now that you are in this prison, in this case, the prison of the walk. I think there's something also interesting as you see these boys progress, that their ability to control their emotional states gets less and less and less as they are worn out by the walk. More importantly, as they're emotionally worn out by the walk. And you see experiences where they go from extreme emotions in the blink of an eye. There is a moment actually where our main character has this great feeling of lust, really strong, this sexual tension. And he even actually has an orgasm in his pants as he's walking. And then less than half a page later, he has this blinding rage, this murderous rage towards another character. And he even says, I don't know where it came from, but it's there. He flips between these extreme emotions so quickly because the ability to regulate his emotional state is something that he's given up in exchange for engaging in this walk. Right? So that is another thing that distances him from being human, having a capacity to actually engage and to regulate our emotions and to be aware of what we're feeling and why. That is something we have. And yet we often forfeit it. We often ignore it. We often let ourselves be controlled by our emotions instead of recognizing that as humans, we have the capacity to say, why am I angry right now? How is that benefiting me? Why do I feel so sad, so lustful, so overwhelmed? And that doesn't make the emotions go away. Right? But we have the capacity to look into ourselves and see where the emotions come from, and then try to engage in different types of practice to ameliorate those emotions and not let those emotions govern our actions, but let us control our emotions instead. And that is something you see that is lost in this walk. There's an interesting section too, where as they're walking and there's a crowd that's formed, and they compare the crowd to animals. What is it about this that is the spectacle that is so amazing for them? They're nothing but animals, And someone goes on a really interesting rant that says, yes, they are animals, but them being animals, does that mean we're humans? And he realizes that we're all in the same boat, right? There's this spectacle of death. The reason people crowd around them is because the proximity to dead men makes them feel more alive. And that is this base guttural instinct, a fear of your own death, a fear of what it means to be human. It's not accepting the circumstances you're living in and trying to seek out some sort of immortality, to not realize how fragile our bodies are and not make the best use of them as we can. The boys are constantly dehumanizing each other too, because that is the safest way for them to engage in any sort of relationship and to overcome this kind of real strong psychic pain and emotional pain that comes along, this violence of being part of this walk. And the antagonist character is named Barkovich, and at one point, our main character has a talk with him, and he does something kind of nice. He agrees to do something nice. They realize one of the other walkers, is actually married. He's 17, but he had dropped out of school when he was 15, and he married his sweetheart, who is a year older than him, and now she is pregnant, and he's walking. And he is the head-on favorite. Everyone expects him to win. But at some point, he catches pneumonia, because for 2 nights they had to walk in the rain. And everyone realizes that he's not going to make it. He is messed up. And they all agree, or all of, the group agrees, the group that we follow at least, that if they win, they will do something for his family, that they will go out of their way to give some sort of money or support to his wife and to his future child. And our main character speaks to Barkovich, this antagonist character, and the antagonist finally agrees and says, fine, I'll do it. And after that, instead of making our main character happy, it terrifies him. And he says that Barkovich does have some humanity left in him. And it's that humanness about him that makes him scary. That is what scares him. You have to separate the human from the individual in order to engage in this kind of violence against yourself and against everyone else. As they're getting along farther in the walk, they reach a big city that has a huge crowd. And even before they can see the crowd, they can hear it from, I think, a mile away or something. And at some point, our main character stops thinking of the crowd as people, but he thinks of it as crowd with a capital C, the God crowd, the God who consumes, right? Who it isn't human beings anymore. It is something bigger than human beings. It is something that is so animalistic that all it does is consume. It screams out its horror and its wonder at the same time at this spectacle. And there has to be this level of disconnection, right? Of becoming something that is only meant to be consumed. And you are consumed by the people surrounding you who are no longer human, but there's something bigger and something else than human. There is a mob mentality that is bigger than your individuality. And part of what you give up by giving into your persuadable nature is you give up your humanity. You give up your opportunities by going along with the status quo and by giving in to your base emotions. What you're doing is you're sacrificing your ability to have a meaningful life or the potential of that, right? By becoming part of the God crowd. Even amongst all this, you see Garrity working to maintain his grasp on humanity. It isn't until really close to the end that you see that he really gives it up. And what happens is when they get very close to the end, the boys make a pact that they'll no longer help one another. And before that, Garrity had helped his friend McVrees more than once. He would have been ticketed. And the same thing, Garrity would have been ticketed if McVrees hadn't helped him. So they help each other along this walk, even though they know that only one of us can make it out. But at some point they say there's only a few of us left, so it has to be everyone for themselves. No helping. And so when he agreed to it, that's when he felt like he gave up his last shred of humanity. And he says, now I'm an animal. Nothing but a tired, dirty, stupid animal. You did it. You sold out. So that is when he actually gave up everything. And yet that same night, the boy who had instigated this, the boy who had said we need to be one, each one for themselves, he had lost his jacket and he's cold in the middle of the night and he's shivering. And our main character looks at him and tries not to care about him. He tries not to have any empathy, and it makes him sick. He feels sick to his stomach by trying not to care about this person. So even at the end, he isn't able to give up that small slice of humanity. And it just makes me think of how powerful it is, our experiences as humans, and how we have this inherent ability to connect to others, to be in community with others, to want to serve others. And yet, so many of the messages we get from outside and from inside say, that's not important. Focus on yourself, right? You're more important than others. Seeing him react in that way, I think was really powerful to see that he tries to give up his shred of humanity and not care about this person, and it makes him sick to do so. I don't know, for me, that was a really powerful moment. It also shows how, in order to win this race, you have to give up your humanity. But that is a huge cost. Okay, so those are the kind of things that came up for me related to Perfect Human Rebirth. Or tangentially related to it. But there are a lot of other things that came up as well. So I want to talk about a few other ideas, a few other things that came up for me as I was reading this book. I think it's really interesting when you see the first young boy die. Before then, they obviously were all afraid of dying, but they're putting on this bravado, right? And they don't have this real existential fear of death until they see someone die. And that's the first moment. And what's interesting about it is Garrity watches this boy get shot in the head, and he wonders, did it hurt, right? And then he says, but of course it had hurt. It had hurt before, in the worst rupturing way, knowing there would be no more you, but the universe would roll on just the same, unharmed and unhampered. So he sees this young boy being killed, and he has this moment of existential dread. And for me, I just think of what is our place in the world? This idea that everything exists outside of me, right? My death in the big picture will be insignificant. So how do I make my life now meaningful, knowing that the world will continue when I'm not here? It'll roll on unharmed and unhampered. How can I make my life something valuable? How can I find meaning in the face of existential dread? And isn't that what we're all trying to do? Isn't that the point of engaging in a spiritual practice, is to find some sort of solace when you face the inevitable, right? That is what spirituality does for us. It tries to create a sense of meaning to the chaos. When you see these young characters facing this existential dread, you have to ask, what am I alive for? Like, what is the purpose of my life? And the answer I come to as a Buddhist is, my life exists so I can serve others in whatever way is appropriate and meaningful to me, right? based on my skill set, based on my opportunities, based on my study, my practice, whatever tools I have to be of service to others, to help eliminate others' suffering. That is what makes my life meaningful, and that is why I exist. That is my purpose. And that may not be the same for everyone, but some flavor of that. How the way we can make this brief moment we have in this one life that we may never achieve again, because it's so difficult to achieve this perfect human birth. The one blink of an eye moment we have, how do we make the most of it? And how do we not suffer the pain that this young boy is expressing when he thinks about death? Because he says it's not the moment of death that hurts, it's the moment before, the moment when you think about what's going to happen. How can we avoid that pain? And the way we avoid that pain is by making our lives meaningful, by doing something with our life, which doesn't mean getting your name on the side of a building. It doesn't mean making a lot of money. It doesn't mean having a huge family and creating a huge family line. It means being of service, right? That is the difference we can make. There's a moment as they continue, and they've been walking for, I think, maybe 9 miles, and there are people on the side of the road sitting, and he starts to feel a really strong jealousy towards the people who are sitting. And at this point, he's only 9 miles in the walk, right? It's not very far. But he has this incredibly strong jealousy because sitting down, the simple act of rest, is something he had taken for granted before. And so it made me think of what are all the things that I take for granted all the time. Simple things, like sitting down, like being able to put my feet up, that I take them for granted until I don't have those opportunities anymore. It's really interesting that the thing that he's jealous of isn't the other freedoms, but it's simply sitting down. And it creates this unspeakable jealousy in him. So that was a moment for me to really think, how many things do I take for granted every day where I am afforded all these opportunities and I don't relish them in the way that I should be relishing them? Something else that I found really, it took me for a moment, is the way sex and violence are associated with power and what it means to have power. There is a scene where it's raining at this point, and Garrity sees all the soldiers as they're there in the rain, and they are not reacting at all. And he says, and also before this point, since Garrity is from Maine, and they start in Maine, he's the hometown boy. So there are many times where on the side of the road, people will have his name or his number, and they're cheering for him. And right in the beginning of the race, or the walk rather, it's not a race, there's some young women on the side of the road holding his sign. And he gives into this primal instinct, and he runs over to them, and he starts kissing them and like copping a feel, and they let him. And he's overwhelmed by this lust, and he runs over and does this. Even though he has a girlfriend, he feels guilty about it later. But he has this moment where he goes and he gets a kiss from a pretty girl standing on the side of the road. And so in this scene, it's raining, and he looks at the soldiers, and it says, Garrity looked up at the soldiers. They were wet too, of course, but if they were uncomfortable, they didn't show it. Their faces were perfectly wooden. I wonder what it feels like, he thought, just to shoot someone down. I wonder if it makes them feel powerful. He remembered the girl with the sign, kissing her, feeling her ass, feeling her smooth underpants under her pedal pushers. That had made him feel powerful. I just think it's such a great assessment of the young man's mind, right? That power comes through sex or violence. Those are the things that make us feel powerful. And that's such a mistaken understanding of power, right? But that is what we cling to. That is this external trapping that we think is power. And as long as that is what we're holding on to as being sources of actual power, we're never going to be powerful, right? We're always going to be under the power of our emotions, of our afflictive minds. But so often we look towards violence and we look towards attachment as if they were sources of power, sources of strength, when in fact they're weaknesses, right? That's not to say all relationships that are based on desire are harmful, but to say that that is a source of power, sexual conquest is power, of course not. Violence is power? No. Violence is violence, right? It's not power, it's weakness. Yet, as a young man especially, this is true for everyone, but I think especially young men, we're taught that these are the ways we control the world around us. And so this makes me think, what is genuine power? I look at the people in my life who I've met who seem really powerful. And those are people who are very much in tune with their inner selves. They have control over their mind, over their emotions. They aren't overwhelmed by the events of the world around them, no matter how high or how low things happen. That is power, right? They don't have any political power. They may not have wealth. They don't have any of these external trappings that look like power to the contemporary mindset, or even the ancient mindset, let's be honest, the human mindset. Yet that is power. So just this moment, this very clear moment where sex and violence are directly linked to being power, or to creating the feeling of being powerful, that made me think, what is it that makes me feel powerful? When do I feel powerful in my life? And it's when I'm able to control my emotions, right? I've been practicing for decades, and obviously I still have anger. I still have attachment. I still have jealousy. Those emotions still come. I haven't conquered them. But when I'm able to see those emotions as they rise, and before acting on them, recognize them, and then calm them down and act out of a calm mind instead, that feels like a huge victory. That's an incredible moment of power for me. That is the power that I'm chasing. The power to be able to control my mind in such a way that I can dedicate it to others and not feel like I am under the control of my negative emotions. That is powerful for me. Moving on through the book, there's a scene that does feel very Buddhist, actually. There is a really wonderful little dialogue, or monologue rather, where they're talking about what they would do with the prize money and if it's worth it in the end, and how would they make whatever prize they could receive to be worth all of the violence and the trauma they're going through. And Garrity is getting more and more frustrated because he sees that it's not worth it, that there can't be anything that's worth it. And he says, "You don't understand," Garrity said, more exasperated than ever. "Potato soup or sirloin tips, a mansion or a hovel. Once you're dead, that's it. They put you on a cooling board like Zuck or Hewing, and that's it. You're better to take it one day at a time. That's all I'm saying. If people just took it a day at a time, they'd be a lot happier." That is a lot of Buddhist philosophy in a nutshell, and a lot of other philosophies, right? That we're so preoccupied with what we could be getting in the future that we are not paying attention to what we have now. We're so preoccupied with the things we don't have, that we're grasping for, that we are missing sight of what we do have, of the opportunities and the joys and all of the pleasures that we do have in this life. We miss sight of them because we're looking for more always. We're always thirsty for more, right? So we're giving up our opportunity for joy, our opportunities for happiness, because we're focused on the things we don't have instead of on the things we have. If we take it one day at a time, then we'd be happier. We wouldn't always be lost searching for something that we don't have. Another scene that popped out for me is this disgust, a moment of disgust that Garrity has at the spectacle of what's going on. That part of being on this long walk is, in order to engage in this, you have to elevate it as to something meaningful, right? This is something important that they're doing. This is a meaningful thing. This is a national activity. This is, you have to imbue greater meaning and spectacle to what is really not that, in order to make it make sense, right? And there's a moment of disgust that he has, not at the individuals, but at the sense of spectacle, that he sees through it. And what it is there is a walker who gets sick, who has diarrhea. And he is trying to walk through this diarrhea, and he ends up being shot with his pants down, and it's really awful. So before he gets shot, Garrity looks at him and it says, Garrity felt disgusted. There was no fascination in this, no mystery. It was a boy with a bellyache, that was all. And it was impossible to feel anything but disgust and a kind of animal terror. His own stomach rolled queasily. Just the sense that we have to create or fabricate this idea of meaning to justify this horror, but there's no meaning there. It's all a fabrication, right? There's no value to this. And the only way we can make sense of it is by fabricating or projecting this false idea of meaning. But in the end, there's nothing. It's all spectacle. It's a smoke show. And what that made me really think of is we talk about being fascinated with what we call the perfections of samsara. So samsara is the perpetual cycle of life and death that is beyond our control, this cycle of suffering that is due to our constant creation of negative karma, right? Our birth, death, and rebirth that is out of our control, under the whims of karma and afflictions. That's called samsara. And the perfections of samsara are all the things in this life that give the appearance of being meaningful, of being beautiful, of being joyful, but all they are is attachment and grasping at something that is ultimately hollow or empty, grasping at your ego, at pride, at external validation. These are the perfections of samsara. We have to build up these ideas in such ways that they can create meaning for something that is utterly meaningless. So being disgusted with the spectacle is really important, right? Seeing the spectacle of samsara, of the suffering of the world around us, and not letting ourselves be swayed by how beautiful that big house is, right? Or, that new car. Not letting us be swayed by giving into this idea of lust or of temptation, right? Of all of the many perfections that exist in suffering. So they aren't real perfections. The term perfection comes up in other contexts in Buddhism. Here, it's kind of an ironic use to say the perfection of samsara is nothing but suffering, because samsara itself has the very nature of discontentment. So the perfections of samsara, or the miracles, the majesties of samsara, are nothing but empty spectacle. And when he realizes that there's so much spectacle being celebrated in this walk, but there's no spectacle, there's only young boys with stomach cramps. To go through a few other things that were interesting to me, there's a really wonderful monologue about going crazy and about the darkness. And I wanted to call that out. I think it's a really nice piece of writing from a young king. This is during the first night that they spend walking. So it's their first time walking in the dark, and he's waiting for dawn, and the darkness is driving him crazy. And he says, "Dawn was a century away. Many of them would never see the dawn or the sun. They were buried 6 feet deep in the darkness. All they needed was the monotonous chanting of the priest, his voice muffled but not entirely obscured by the new packed darkness above which the mourners stood. The mourners were not even aware that they were here. They were alive. They were screaming and scratching and clawing at the coffin-lid darkness. The air was flaking and rusting away. The air was turning into poison gas, hope fading until hope itself was darkness. And above all of it, the nodding chapel bell voice of the priest and the impatient, shuffling feet of the mourners, anxious to be off into the warm May sunshine. Then, overmastering that, the sighing, shuffling chorus of the bugs, the beetles, squirming their way through the earth, coming for the feast. I could go crazy, Garrity thought. I could go right the fuck off my rocker." First, I think that's just a really beautiful piece of writing from King. But it made me think, what do we do when we are face to face with unknowing? When we are face to face with darkness? When it feels like the dawn will never come? When there is that moment of despair? How do we avoid being lost in that, right? How do we find inner resources to face the unknown, right? To face what scares us the most and find resiliency within ourselves? Now, he doesn't have an answer for it. His answer is survive by pure luck. But for me, I think of what resources do I have when I face the unknown, when I have moments of fear, when I have moments of overwhelming or anxiety, when I have moments that kind of cripple me, whether they be from anxiety or fear or feeling like I'm not good enough, right? When I face that darkness, what inner resources have I found to buoy myself up, right? To bring the light within myself to combat that darkness. That I don't wait for the dawn of someone else's light. I bring that light with me. And not only do that, I bring that light for other people. I seek out others' darkness, because that is how I find my light. Speaking of how they have to dehumanize one another in order to survive, there's a scene where there's a boy who keeps falling down, number 45. And at first, Garrity is struggling to remember what his name is before he dies. And it says, 45 fell down again. Footsteps quickened as the boys scattered. Not long after, the gongs roared. Garrity decided the boy's name must not have been important anyway. He decided the boy's name must not be important anyway. What do we convince ourselves to compensate for our bad decisions? When we feel like we have no option, how do we justify engaging in harmful behavior? How do we justify engaging in selfish behavior? When it feels like we have no options left, what does that really mean? So in this case, the only way he could move on was by saying, I guess that boy's name didn't matter anyway. He had to convince himself of that. Otherwise, it would have eaten at him, not knowing his name, right? Instead, he was just 45. That's all he could be. Garrity had to convince himself that that's all he was. Because to be more than 45 would have broken Garrity. What do I convince myself of? What am I trying to avoid? You know? When am I trying to avoid others' humanity? When is others' humanity too much for me? Especially if they're people that make my life difficult. Isn't it easier to demonize someone, especially if they're acting in a harmful way, than to see their humanity, than to see their suffering, to see that all their actions that are causing harm aren't because they actually have a joy in causing harm, but because they want to be happy and they don't want to suffer and they don't know how to go about achieving that end. And they think that whatever harm they're causing is going to bring about actual happiness, and it won't, right? Isn't it easier just to say, no, they're a bad person, to write them off? Isn't it easier to convince ourselves that their names don't matter? When do other people's names don't matter to me? When do I make those decisions? Where in my life have I done that? And how can I avoid doing that? It's a few other random thoughts before we close up. There are a few moments where they talk about the different boys' motivation. And that made me think a lot. There's one boy, like I said, Barkovich is kind of an asshole the whole time. And one other character, at some point he realizes, he thinks, I'm not going to win, but I'm going to last longer than him. I'm going to watch him die. And pure like spite will keep me alive until he falls. And so I was thinking, how much do our motivations affect our actions? You know, in Buddhism, our motivations are incredibly important. Our mental actions are far more important than our physical actions. We say that there's actions of body, speech, and mind, but of those three, the actions of mind are most important because every action of body or every action of speech is preceded by an action of mind, a mental action. And so having proper motivation for doing something is wildly important in Buddhism, incredibly, incredibly important. So this opportunity to realize that these boys had very different motivations for starting the walk, and then as they're walking, very different motivations for continuing, and to seeing how those different boys with different motivations, how it either empowers them or weakens them in their attempt at survival, in their physical action. Just that relationship between motivation and action, I thought was something that is worth thinking about. And it's sometimes made very, very clear in this book. There are also a number of moments where we celebrate other people's suffering, whether it be celebrating a boy going down, especially the crowd celebrating boys being murdered. And it happens over and over again. And it's mixed, right, with this grief, this sadness, this knowing that I will die as well. But so constantly I come across this. What is it about others' suffering that makes us feel a sense of joy? And how perverted is that we ever take joy in suffering? But we do it. It's our natural instinct. There's a word for it, Schadenfreude, right? We take joy when others don't do well because it makes us feel better about ourselves, our own inadequacies, right? It makes us feel better about all the things that we don't do well when we see others miserable. And this book, this book marinates in that. This book is all about seeing others destroyed for sport, which isn't new, right? Blood sport is not a new thing. This book isn't uncommon in that way, but it's in every page of this book. And you see our main character fighting against it, knowing that there's no pleasure to be had in this suffering. Yet even he feels a sense of relief when another boy goes down, because that brings him one step closer to him not dying. And the crowd is crazy in their fever for destruction. What is it about seeing others suffering brings us this false sense of happiness? And how destructive is that to us, right? How destructive is it to me to have any mind of rejoicing when I see someone suffering? When I make a habit of running towards suffering instead of away from it? It does nothing but destroy me, right? It hurts me to do that in the immediate sense and in the big picture. Yet I do it all the time, not on purpose. I try not to, but I know I do. What is it about seeing others who are miserable that lifts me up? And how can I avoid that? And the opposite of that is, as I've talked a lot about on this channel, rejoicing. It's celebrating. It's celebrating others' victories. When someone achieves something, you celebrate it. You have joy for their virtuous behavior. You have joy for their wins. Celebrating others, rejoicing in good deeds. That is how you combat the instinct to rejoice in suffering, to have this perverted type of rejoicing, this negative rejoicing. Another idea that came up for me is this idea of as human beings, we are more than one thing. We have so many labels, some of which we prescribe to ourselves and others that are given to us from the outside. And to some extent, those labels can be useful. They help us know where we can fit in, how we can be of most help. They help organize society in a way that can be helpful, but they can also be limiting. And it can feel like we are trapped inside a thing. And there's this great moment where he realizes that we don't have to be only one thing. At one point, his friend McVree says to him, "The reason all of this is so horrible," McVree said, "is because it's just trivial, you know? We've sold ourselves and traded our souls on trivialities. Olson, he was trivial. He was magnificent, too. But those things aren't mutually exclusive. He was magnificent and he was trivial. Either way, or both, he died like a bug under a microscope." There's this idea that we have as Buddhists that say every single sentient being has the capacity to become a Buddha. We will all become perfected beings. But right now, we are suffering beings. We are beings that are made up of these afflicted minds, of self-grasping, of ego, of anger and attachment. That is what controls the way we exist in the world. But that's not all we are. We aren't limited by that. We have infinite capacity, right? We have the capacity of perfection, of omniscience. Every single sentient being does. But that doesn't mean we aren't human at the same time. That doesn't mean we don't have to work for that. We can be magnificent and trivial at the same time. The idea in Sanskrit, we call it Tathagatagarbha, the kind of seed of enlightenment, or the embryo of enlightenment. Every sentient being is the exact same in their capacity to become a Buddha. Every sentient being. Right now, we're suffering sentient beings that are filled with all of these kleshas, these negative minds. That doesn't stop us from having the potential to be Buddhas. And so because of that, we have to see that potential not only in ourselves, but in others as well. We have to nourish that potential. We have to water it. We have to put energy into ripening that potential. Because we are trivial and magnificent at the same time. All of us. There are moments as he gets on where he says the constant death wears on him, right? The smell of death has invaded his nostrils. And that is one of the hardest things for him to overcome mentally, is not his own fear of dying, but that he is surrounded by dying all the time. And so he does it by trying to distract himself by thinking of his girlfriend or thinking other things like this. But it made me think, how is that different than our everyday life? Being on the walk, being put into these extreme circumstances, it strips away the veneer that you're going to live forever. Because really, we're surrounded by death all the time. We have the capacity to die at any moment. And this is actually a topic that I'll be discussing more in the next video, which is on impermanence and death. But when you put yourself on the walk, what that does is it refuses to let you pretend that you're going to live until tomorrow, because the overwhelming majority of those boys are not. When you have death surrounding you all the time, you can't distract yourself from it. We spend so much of our lives trying to run away from the fact that we're going to die, that we forget to live. We forget to make our lives meaningful, right? We waste what time we have. We waste what opportunities we have, trying to run away from the one thing we can never run away from. We can put it off maybe if we're lucky. We can do some small things that might prolong how long we live, but ultimately we don't have any control of it, right? There are so many things outside of our control. It's the one guaranteed thing we have in this life. And yet we try to distract ourselves from it all the time instead of letting it motivate us to make this moment, this day, meaningful. We fill our lives with consumption, especially with distraction, as a way to pretend we're not going to die. And that doesn't make death any farther off. All it does is waste our opportunities. There's a great line as you get closer to the end. One of them says, even when you're walking with no warnings, there's only 2 minutes between you and the inside of a cemetery fence. That's not much time. There's always only 2 minutes between us and the inside of a cemetery fence. Even when you're walking with no warnings. Even when it seems like everything is going right for you. Everything is working out you got that promotion, uh, everyone in your family is treating you well, all the things you want are lining up. You are one heartbeat away from being dead. Are you using your time in a way that's meaningful? Are you using this human life and all of the incredible privilege and opportunities you have in a way that is meaningful? I think one of the last things that jumped out at me that I want to talk about is there's a point where one of the boys says, I don't want to die this way, Abraham said. He was crying. Not in public, with people rooting for you to get up and walk another few miles. It's so fucking mindless. It's just fucking mindless. This has about as much dignity as an idiot strangling on his own tongue and shitting his pants at the same time. This idea that it's mindless to die without dignity, I think is really interesting. Because what is dignity? What is it mean to die in a way that isn't mindless? Obviously, sacrificing yourself for this god of American exceptionalism does not seem like a very mindful way to die, as the boys did in this walk. But it made me think, what is a mindless death for me? What is a death in dignity? And I have done hospice care work. I've worked with people who are dying. Just this last year, my mother died of breast cancer, and I was with her doing end-of-life care for quite a few weeks. First in the beginning of her diagnosis, when she was after surgery, and then I had to return to the monastery. Then I came back to the US again and was with her after all of the therapies they tried didn't work, and she had gone downhill quite a lot, and I was taking care of her then. I had to return to the monastery again, but then I made it back one more time, and I was with her doing end-of-life care when she passed away. And there's a strong wish we have to die with dignity. But what does that mean? What does it mean to die with dignity? I know what it meant for my mother, and so I did everything I could to let her have that. But I don't think her definition would be the same as mine. She's not a student of mine. I'm not going to impose my beliefs on her. I did my best to give her what she wanted. But for me, to die with dignity means to die with a mind that is calm, to die with a mind that knows I have lived a life that's meaningful, that I have not wasted my life, which is to say that knows that I have spent my life in the best way possible, working for the benefit of others. That doesn't mean I always succeeded, doesn't mean I was a perfect person, but it means I made effort everywhere I could to be of service, to help others, to try to eliminate others' suffering. That is a mind that would be peaceful at the time of death. And that's what it means to me to die with dignity. When you see these young boys in this book volunteer to be part of this with the vague hope they might get a prize, only to have everything crash down around them when they realize how horrible this is. They lose all sense of dignity. So I wonder, for me, how can I keep my sense of dignity, whatever that means, when I'm in difficult situations, whether it be facing my death or other situations? How can I keep my sense of humility and also my sense of how I exist in the world, my moral center? How can I uphold that when I'm put into difficult situations, when I'm faced with the impossible? Okay. So I don't know if this was helpful for anyone. This was a peek into how I read. And a lot of these things I brought up, they aren't uncommon to Buddhists. Where my mind goes with them might be uncommon, but these ideas, these thoughts, I think are common to anyone that's trying to live in the world and to be a person in the world. And it just so happens that I am predisposed to Buddhist philosophical ideas, or Buddhist, soteriological ideas. And so that is where my mind goes when I do this kind of inquiry. And so I try to read every book this way. And I hope that me, a little bit going through the long walk with you, gave you a little bit of an understanding of not only what it means to have a perfect human rebirth, but an example of how you can engage in intimate reading and find meaningful opportunities for reflection and for growth, even in the work of Stephen King. And so I think with that, today's session is done. I really do thank you very much for spending this time with me. I hope that you get something out of this. The next session, the next episode, I guess it's called, is going to be on impermanence and death. And I'm going to be focusing on the book Lisey's Story. Now, it's a little bit controversial, I know. It was released in 2006. You'll go online, and some people do not like the story at all because King plays with language. The characters have internal shared language they use that's very childish sometimes, and it aggravates some people, and I can appreciate that. I was in a very special place when I first read this book, and when I read it the second time, that was also very eminent for me. So I really, really enjoy this book, and I hope that we can use this book to explore impermanence and death as well as some other ideas as well. So right now, I'm hoping for that to come out the first week of January, which would be, I think, the 6th is the first Monday in January. So that's the goal, that's the aim, and I hope that today's video was helpful for some people, at least gave you a little bit of insight into how I read, and maybe you got a little bit of something out of it, and I hope you can come back in January to join with me again. Until then, I would love to hear some of your thoughts down in the comment section below. Any of the things I mentioned today, did they resonate with you in any way? Did you think I was reaching? Was I bringing too much of myself to the text? If you've read this book, what are things that jumped out for you in the book? Are there things in the book that I totally didn't discuss that were meaningful to you or gave you an opportunity to do some sort of reflection or introspection? I would love to hear all about that in the comments. This kind of conversation is much more suited to a book club where we can have a back and forth. And so I'd love to have some sort of version of that down in the comments below. Until then, I appreciate you. Please be kind to yourselves, take care of each other, and go slowly.